All right, we'll see. Welcome to another episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show. I kind of forget that I also have the banner for the title of this. Welcome, and in keeping with the theme of this month's topic, it's all about backups. Uh, my what I'm going to cover today is. I wish it was a continuation of what I covered last week, where I talked about all of my blunders, but I'm going to squeeze something in there just for the heck of it. Um, Today's topic is all about working with third-party backup tools. And the thing about third-party backup tools is sometimes it's not your decision to make. Sometimes either the VP of IT made a decision and they want to standardize across the board on what products to use. Sometimes it's already been there. You joined a company, it's already using a third-party backup tool, and you end up just leveraging that. And most of the times, it's when you're starting out. Let's say, for instance, you're making the decision, you're picking the right tool to use. You would evaluate a few of them, and then do a quick comparison of the features, the capabilities, what it can do, what it cannot do. But I want to focus more on literally what third-party backup utilities cannot do for you. And we can name a few third-party backup tools like Quest, uh, Lightspeed. I remember working with Lightspeed in my early days, working as a SQL Server DBA. The 2000 SQL Server 2000 version, when I was still working with it, I find it interesting because, for one, having a third-party backup tool means you need to go outside of your comfort zone and learn what capabilities those tools can do, learning the UI, learning the features, all of these things, and then getting another third-party backup tool that does not just cover SQL Server, but also covers just about everything. And typically when decisions are made when purchasing a third-party utility, it's not just because we want something for SQL Server. It typically is something along the lines of we want to standardize across the board. It doesn't matter if it's a SQL Server instance, a SQL Server database, or an Oracle database, or VMs, Exchange, SharePoint, everything covered. And these are the decisions that come into play in choosing the right enterprise third-party backups. You'll be lucky if the company decides, hey, we want to use a third-party backup tool specifically for SQL Server, right? But when you're standardizing across the board, the typical conversation revolves around the fact that, hey, we want to use something that applies to just about everything, right? Because you're standardizing, and then a different team takes care of the third-party tool, and sometimes they would just add SQL Server on top of that. What I've seen in most enterprise environments is they would have something like an IBM TSM, or if they are running on VMs, they would standardize on something like Veeam, or what was that other tool that I was looking at? And they would use that across the board and then just piggyback SQL Server on top of it. Okay, and then what you end up doing if you're with the DBA team is you would evaluate a third-party tool, look at what its capabilities are. But again, when it is already purchased and your only responsibility is to learn how to work with it, then your hands are tied. That's why, again, I want to talk about some of the things that these backup tools cannot do for you. And this is also a side effect of conversations I've had with both my customers who are using third-party utilities for both backups and DR, right? So sometimes it's a combination of just backups where they're taking backups, or sometimes it's a combination of both where they're taking the backups and then shipping those backups, copying those backups onto a remote data center for them to easily do DR exercises, or literally restore backups from restore from the backups into a totally different data center, right? So I hope you have your pen and paper ready. It's one of those times when my notes are on my phone, but not necessarily on a piece of paper. First one, your third part, and this is also something, like I said, that you have to do on your own, over and above learning the features, learning the capabilities, um, incorporating SQL Server on those third-party tools, and whether or not you decide you want to use agents for those backups, or just use SQL Server native backups and then dump the backup files on the network share and let the backup tool, third-party backup tool, pick up the files from those and either stream them off of a network attached storage or somewhere. Now people are putting backup files on the cloud like S3 or Azure Blob Storage. But again, these are the things that you have to do yourself and not rely on your third-party backup tools, right? So again, grab your pen and paper. Make sure you're taking notes. The first one is your third-party backup tool cannot define your RPO, your RTO, and SLA. Okay? The third-party backup tool cannot define your recovery point objective, your recovery time objective, and SLA. Typically, when you get a third-party tool, the more often than not, people look at the capabilities of what the frequency of the backups would look like. Oh, there's a daily backup. There's backups every 8 hours, every 6 hours, every hour, every minute. Are we taking snapshots? Are we taking full plus differential plus log backups? There may be different terminologies even. Backup tools would use stuff like differential and then incremental, whereas if you're looking at SQL Server, you're looking at full, differential, and transaction log backups. You may be speaking the same language, but then the backup tool might be referring to it differently. Okay, even if they use an agent to back up the databases. But again, first thing that most sysadmins and DBAs would do is look at the schedule and look at what are the frequencies. How often can I take those backups? Can we do daily? Can we do weekly? Can we do monthly? But even though every backup utility would have the time, the schedule, and everything that you could think of when it comes to the frequency, it still cannot define your recovery point, your recovery time objectives, and your service level agreements. You have to first make it clear. And oftentimes I see it being done the other way around. In my case, whenever I come into a new environment and they don't have anything yet, the first thing that I do is I will just create a full database backup and then log backups every 15 minutes just because I don't know what they want. I don't know what their recovery point objectives are. I don't know what their recovery time objectives are. I don't know what their SLAs are. I just need to have something in order for me to go back into it in case something happens. But immediately after setting up those job schedules for taking backups, I would get them into the conversation of what is our recovery point and recovery time objective. How much data can you afford to lose? How much downtime can you afford? Any backup tool will take a backup depending on the frequency of the time that you set it to. If you want to set it to daily backups or twice a day backups, daily backups, not twice a day daily backups, but twice a day backups, you can set the schedule, you can configure the agent, you can do either, if you're dealing with VMs, take a snapshot, you could do anything you could think of as far as scheduling and frequency is concerned, but any backup tool will not define your recovery point objective. It is still your responsibility to have that conversation. I'm not saying that you should be the one defining the recovery point and recovery time objectives. It has to come from people who are making those decisions. And interestingly, even when people start asking questions about, hey, this is our third-party backup utility, we had this disaster, or we are taking backups on a regular basis, this frequency, how do I work with my DR strategy? We don't know anything about your recovery point, your recovery time objectives. All we can say, in my case as a consultant, is all I can say is, well, first, let's be clear on that. Let's be clear on how much data can you afford to lose? How much time can you afford, or how much downtime can you afford if something goes wrong, and what's the worst case scenario, right? It has to start from having that definition. And again, oftentimes there will be people who would evaluate third-party utilities. They would download an eval copy, do whatever it is that they want within the next 15 days or however long that the eval copy is available for you to use. Do whatever you want with it and test every single thing. Oh, I can take a full backup. I can take a log backup. I can take differential. Oh, I managed to restore it. Okay, but you're doing the strategy, like taking the backups and restoring from the backups, without being clear on what the recovery point and recovery time objectives are. It's just like saying buying something, using the thing that you bought, and you don't know exactly what you want to use it for specifically, right? Even when, and it's interesting again, because we are still talking about backups 50 plus years after the invention of the first storage media, yet we are still having conversations around how much data can you afford to lose, how much downtime can you afford, and what's the worst case scenario. Typically, again, like I said, third-party tools are being evaluated based on features and capabilities. Well and good, but what good are features and capabilities if you don't know what those are? So again, first thing, third-party backup tools cannot and will not, I say will not, never. Third-party tools will never, ever define your recovery point and recovery time objectives. It is, again, it is not your responsibility as a technical professional, sysadmin, DBA, or whoever's responsible for taking the backups. It is never your responsibility to define what those are. It's the businesses. They have to be very clear about what the business is at risk for if the data is lost. What is the business at risk for if the servers or the database servers cannot be brought online within X amount of hours, right? Because we don't know. And oftentimes, because people who are making those decisions are not aware, they would simply say, we want zero downtime and zero data loss. This is the part where you have to get them clear about the costs of zero downtime and zero data loss. Okay. Again, any third-party backup utility cannot and will not define your recovery point objective, your recovery time objectives, and service level agreement. Okay. Second thing. Interestingly, I've read so many documentation from third-party backup utilities, and this thing again, excuse me, is not something that they can do. Third-party backup utilities cannot write your DR processes, cannot and will not write your DR processes. You've probably heard me say a couple of times now, I don't really believe in backups. I believe in being able to successfully restore from backups and making sure that the data actually works, meaning the data is valid. You've checked it, you validated it. Beyond running CheckDB on SQL Server databases is checking whether or not the data is indeed as off whatever recovery point objective you've defined, right? Because again, it's easy to restore from backup, to restore a database backup successfully. You ran CheckDB. There was no corruption. But to actually validate that you've met your recovery point objective is something that you have to include in your DR process. Again, oftentimes, and I also see this in forums, news groups, online communities where somebody would ask, we're using this third-party tool, and this is the frequency of the backups that we're taking, and we just had an outage, unexpected disaster. Maybe their data center lost power, and now they have to resort rather to restoring everything. And I'm not just talking about SQL Server databases here. I'm talking about everything. What do I need to do? I don't know. I don't know what your recovery objectives are for DR. Third-party backups, third-party backup utilities will not, cannot, and will not define your DR processes for you. I want to tie this back to the first thing, where it cannot and will not define your recovery point and recovery time objectives. Because it cannot and will not define your recovery point and recovery time objectives, it cannot think of your worst case scenario, right? Um, Interestingly, there are some not issues, but tragic events happening in a state of Ohio where trains are getting derailed, and sometimes that would affect places within wherever that incident happened, either power outages or, again, worst case scenario, your data center gets affected. And then what do you do? If you have not defined a DR process, if you have not created a DR documentation, don't ever rely on your backups. Okay? Why is that? Because if you don't have a DR process in place and you don't have a DR documentation in place, what ends up happening is you would do a restore based on what you've tested. It's just human nature. You get back to your familiar. Like I said in the beginning, people would download an evaluation copy of the third-party tool that they're using, install it, do their backups, do their restores, and that's it. And then claim, okay, it works. If you've never done your or if you've never defined your DR processes, and you've never created a DR document, when a real disaster happens, you end up doing exactly what you did, okay, when you were evaluating the software or the third-party tool. And sometimes it could be catastrophic, because there is a sequence of how you would restore your backups based on what type of backups you've taken, and based on the frequency of the backups you've taken. Here's an example. Let's say you've created a database backup for SQL Server that's one full database backup, or maybe it's too large. You created one database backup every week, full database backup. And then you're doing daily differentials, and then you're doing maybe 30-minute transaction log backups. Just because you have a sequence of database backups taken from full database backup, differential, and then transaction log backups, doesn't mean that that's exactly how you will be able to restore it in a real disaster. You've probably heard me say, or I say this a lot in these weekly conversations that we're having, is you'll hear me say a lot that in a real disaster, the state of mind of the person performing the disaster recovery process is going to influence whether or not the restore would actually happen. Okay. Again, using the example that I use, full every week, differential every day, and log backups every week. If you do not have a DR process where you're, number one, clear on how much downtime you can afford, right? How much downtime can you afford before you can even restore from everything that the backup is taken? You create a full database backup every week. If you've only tested one differential, your first instinct would be to take whatever differential you can grab from the backup. And again, first instinct, I didn't say it's in the documentation. Because for one, if you don't have a documentation, you'll always fall back to first instinct or your default. And your default will always be, what have you tested in the past? Even worse, if you've ever tested restoring from those backups, then your default would be to panic and freeze in, just like deer in the headlight situation where you can't even do anything. Why? Because you haven't tested restoring from those backups, right? So again, restoring the full, restoring the differential, only to realize, oops, I don't think I can restore from the log backups that I've taken on the last day, because, well, the log sequence chain is not continuous. And so you do it again. The amount of time it takes for you to do everything as you fumble around, okay, as you fumble around picking what backup types, what backup files to work on, is going to eat up on your recovery time objective. That's just one simple case. Another case is, again, it's a third-party tool. It's your sysadmins taking care of the backups. They either install the agent on the SQL Server machine, or they just pick up the files, put it on network attached storage. If you don't know how those backups are being stored on a network attached storage, how will you be able to restore? You're now relying on whoever is responsible for picking up the backups for them to restore. Now, if they don't know the sequence of files or the sequence of the backups that they're taking, because again, they may know that you are taking daily full database backups, or maybe once a week daily backup and a daily differential. They may know that, but they don't know which files to give you. You have to tell them explicitly. So even the amount of time it takes for you to tell whoever's responsible for taking backups, even the amount of time it takes for you to tell them that these are the files that you need. You need the full database backup, the latest full, the latest differential, and all the transaction log backups taken from the latest differential backup. You have to tell that person that. Now, if the files are not properly labeled, if the files are mixed with other, because again, enterprise backups, third-party backups, they're taking care of everything. What is to prevent the person who is taking the backups from mixing this all with Exchange backups, Active Directory backups, file backups from your file servers? What is preventing them from mixing this database backups that you, the DBA, should be responsible for, and mixing them with everything else? Like I said, if you don't have a DR process in place, if you don't have a DR document written for your specific third-party tool, your backup tool will not and will never do that for you. Okay? So the first one is you have your third-party tool will not define your recovery point, recovery time objective. Your second one is your backup tool will not write or will not create your DR strategy for you. It will not create your DR process for you. Even the people involved, right? Again, most enterprise backups, they will use it across the board, and then either they will install an agent on the SQL Server instance or SQL Server machine and either take a backup and then stream it across the network. Depending on how you tell the person, or if they give you the permission to do that, and depending on the strategy, the backup strategy that you use, it still has to meet your recovery point, recovery time objective. And when the time comes that you need to restore from those backups, you need to have a proper process. Who do I need to talk to? What permissions do I need to have? What files do I need to grab? Or do I have direct access to the files so that I can do it myself? Or do I have to rely on a person responsible for taking care of the backups just for me to grab those backups? And again, when you don't have a recovery time objective in place, or you've defined this is how much downtime I can afford, the clock starts ticking the minute that the database becomes unavailable. Okay, so that's the second one. The third one, and this I learned firsthand, my own story. Again, this should have been included in the previous week's topic of my top 3 backup blunders. The third one is that the third-party backup utility will not prevent anybody with the right permissions to perform a restore. Okay, your third-party backups, third-party utilities will never prevent anybody who has the appropriate permissions to perform a restore. Typical conversation, and I saw this online the other day, where a third-party backup requires NT authority system. Okay? It will use the NT authority system, and I say and or because I've seen this, in the past 20 plus years that I've worked in enterprise IT. NT authority system and or sysadmin privileges in order for the backup tool to work? NT authority. I think I can manage NT authority system, but sysadmin? So you're telling me I need sysadmin privileges just to perform backups? We have backup operators. SQL Server has had the backup operator role, server role, ever since I can remember. It is the permission in order for you to do backups. Unfortunately, most third-party tools require sysadmin. When I was working as a data center engineer, I've had a back and forth conversation with a popular, very large global company that has a third-party backup tool. We've had this back and forth between, no, I don't want sysadmin, and let's work together to come up with a permission, appropriate permission for you to take the backups. And they're using an agent for this. They installed an agent. The agent will take the backup from SQL Server, and then it would stream it off to an enterprise storage solution for them to store those backups there. But again, sysadmin. They needed sysadmin. Reached out to their technical account manager. I said, this cannot be. We're very strict on the permissions. Back and forth. It took us a year to finally have least privilege backup operator, least privilege in order for the backup utility to do what it needs to do without having sysadmin privileges. We made it work. Unfortunately, they cannot roll it out because we're not the only customer in the world that use this third-party backup tool. Okay, we're one of the biggest, one of the highest revenue generating for them. We pay them a lot of in terms of licenses globally. The thing is, they cannot just roll it out, and so I ended up saying, okay, let's uninstall the agent. Okay, let's uninstall the agent. I'll just do SQL Server native backups, put them on a local drive. You pick it up from there, and then let your backup tool do what it needs to do. And then I rewrote my entire DR strategy or DR process based on what it did. And I'm not just talking about the permissions required that the third-party tool needs in order to do its work. I'm also referring to the permission of the people involved in either performing the backups and or restoring from backups. Okay. Again, typically it's either the enterprise backup guy, storage guy, or sysadmin would install the agent on a machine, especially in large organizations where you have segregation of duties. DBAs don't have local admin privileges on a box. They would bring in the sysadmin to install the agent, and then based on that, it's the sysadmin the sysadmin would have permissions to restore based on the permissions that he has, both on the SQL Server instance and on the local box, meaning he has local administrative privileges as well as sysadmin privileges for SQL Server. Well, that also violates our least privilege because the sysadmin is not supposed to be sysadmin the sysadmin is not supposed to have SA or sysadmin privileges on the SQL Server instance. So even the definition of what permissions are needed from an entire organization who is responsible for taking the backups and for the permission who's supposed to be taking care of the databases, they have to be consistent across the board. And keep in mind, we're looking at implementing an enterprise-wide backup solution. So from the point of view of the sysadmin, it means, hey, I need to do this job. I need to make sure that you, the DBA, give me the right permissions in order for me to do the job. I already have local admin privileges on the Windows box. You give me sysadmin privileges. And again, it's that fine line between giving the permissions to whoever is needing to do the restore. Then comes the restore, and this is where I said this should have been a part of my previous episode where I talk about some of my blunders. Learned this the hard way when I was still working with System Center suite, System Center Configuration Manager, System Center operations manager, system center virtual machine manager, and system center data protection manager, I have an image of a Windows XP. That's how far ago, that's how long ago this was. Oh, not to mention, because the environment is a regulated industry. They cannot just upgrade to the latest and the greatest. The latest version of the client operating system back then was Windows 7, but they cannot move away from Windows XP because of some of the regulations. I created a snapshot, and in this case, I'm not just a DBA. I was the Now I'm ashamed to say I was the architect, but then I made that mistake. I was the architect designing the system center infrastructure. And part of that is also taking VM snapshots and data snapshots of the VMs, the SQL Server database, and all that. For workstations, we would take snapshots of the workstations, so we can do a P2V restore, meaning we'll take snapshots of the physical machines and do a restore on VM just for DR, right? Because in a real world, because they're in a regulated industry, we have to restore on physical machines as well. And that's for the workstations. I made a mistake of restoring a Windows XP image off of a SQL Server machine. The good thing about it, it's not production, so I'm good. I made a mistake of restoring a Windows XP snapshot to a SQL Server box. This is why, again, this should have been a part of the previous episode where I talk about some of my blunders. This was one of them, and I wasn't really bothered at all because it was in a contained environment. We were doing a POC, and I needed to make sure that part of the deployment is also testing whether or not those backups actually work. Well, at least I knew it worked because I was able to restore a Windows XP image that I've taken from one of the workstations to a SQL Server instance, which tells me, yeah, I can overwrite the entire network with one mistake. Right? Your third-party tool, whether you're using Microsoft's Data Protection Manager, Virtual Machine Manager, or whatever type of third-party utilities, maybe Veeam or anything that does snapshots, or even if it's specifically database backups, right? Specifically database backups. Your third-party tool will not prevent anybody with the right permissions to perform a restore. I'm sure you've had those cases where somebody wanted to restore a backup, a database backup. We're not talking about image backups like the one that I did. That was a huge mistake. I'm sure you've had cases where somebody decided to restore a backup specifically coming from production because they thought they're logging into a development environment, taking a backup from production, restoring the database backup, and overwriting the existing backup or existing database without realizing they were actually connected to a production database server. Kind of scary, especially if the database is that large. I've had several cases back in the days, and the very reason why we created standards in addition to providing least privilege to anybody who has access to database servers. We are very particular about this, and I was pushing back on not having sysadmin privileges. Because for one, again, without the right processes, I'll go back to the first one, without the right recovery point, recovery time objectives, and SLAs, you can take your time, you can take how often you take your backups if they don't meet those objectives. Well, if you don't have those objectives in the first place, well, what's the point? If you don't have the right DR process in place, then how would you be able to restore? And three, with people just having sysadmin privileges and not having the right process, you may end up trying to restore a backup good working backup to a production database, and the person not even knowing that he or she's in production database, right? Again, it's no different from running a delete statement without a where clause and not realizing you're in production. Developers make those mistakes. I made that mistake when I was a developer. Your third-party backup tool will not be able to prevent anybody from restoring from backup so long as they have the right permissions. And this is, again, one of the reasons why I am a big believer on only giving the people permissions to certain environments where they need to, or where they need that permission. Not a big fan of SA. In fact, I'm working with a client today right now, where we are evaluating their entire environment because the application, the third-party application that they're using, requires SA. Literally, SA. Not even a new login with sysadmin privileges. It literally requires SA. So we are re-evaluating the entire platform and checking what activities does the app do to the database, and then being granular about the permissions given to this particular account so that we can create a specific login for the specific application and only give it the right permissions, right? So third-party tools are not simply a means to make life easy. Oh no, although in most cases when somebody would implement a third-party backup tool, it's kind of like a set and forget thing. We run the third-party backup tool, we put it on schedule. We know for a fact that I'm only going to look at the dashboard if a job failed, then I will retry it, right? But it's kind of like a set and forget thing. You run it, it works fine, unless you get a monitoring alert, you ignore it, forget about it. Okay, we don't have, most of the time, the defined recovery point, recovery time objective. We don't have DR processes in place, and we don't have the right permissions, or I don't want to say we don't have the right safeguards to prevent people with unauthorized, and I'm not even referring to unauthorized access, overly authorized permissions. Okay, because again, in an enterprise environment, you wouldn't be giving your developers permissions if they don't need it. They need it. It's just that sometimes we're giving them more than enough permissions, and then all of a sudden they would have to make mistakes that would cost the entire production databases to get screwed, right? So those are what your third-party backup tools cannot do for you. You have to really plan out being able to have a defined recovery point, recovery time objective, being able to have a DR process in place for when worst case scenarios happen, and also making sure that you only give the right permissions to the people who need to do the restores, not to mention, and I don't want to keep my hopes high and only give third-party backup tools the minimum permissions that they need. Most of the time they want SA or sysadmin, because that's what their app was created for, unfortunately, right? So also one of the reasons why every time I need to evaluate a third-party backup tool, the first question I ask is, what's the permission that it needs in order for it to work? If it says SA, I'm not going to use the agent. I'll just use my native SQL Server database backups, and you take care of the rest. But I don't want you having any access to the SQL Server instance with SA privileges. That is about it for this. Yeah, like I said, the last one, when I told you the story about overriding a SQL Server machine with a Windows XP backup, image backup, that should have been a part of the previous episode. But more to go. Like I said, I got more than a dozen stories of my own blunders. I just picked the ones that are relevant. Tune in again next week for another episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show. And if you need help with anything related to high availability disaster recovery for your SQL Server databases, whether you're implementing a new HA solution, or you now need an HA solution for your database, SQL Server databases, and you're kind of confused about what's available out there, or you need to have your DR process created based on what your recovery point and recovery time objectives are, and test everything out. Reach out, use the link on the screen, schedule a strategy session, and let's have that conversation. More than happy to help in any way I can, and if I can help you achieve those, again, recovery time, recovery point objectives, given the right backup and restore strategies, or even picking the right third-party tool that you can use for your entire organization, we can do that. If not, I'll steer you in the direction that will help serve you best. With that, that's all I have for you today. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. I'll see you again in the next episode of the Practical SQL Server HA Show. Goodbye.